It just turned 7 o'clock. So we'll get started. Welcome everybody to our third installment of the 2026 Fish Tales Lecture Series. Tonight we have a very special Fish Tales lecture where you will hear a first-hand account about how Pacific salmon made their way to Door County from a person whose career helped shape one of the most remarkable ecological interventions in the Great Lakes history, the introduction of Pacific salmon to control the exploding populations of alewife and to revive a struggling fishery. But first, I want to remind you of our last Fish Tales Lecture Series in 2 weeks on March 12th. We will have Dr. Dan Eiserman from USGS at the Wisconsin Cooperative Fishery Research Unit at UW-Stevens Point talk about smallmouth bass behavior after they are captured during spawning, tagged with an acoustic tag, and relocated to sites far away from the capture location. Do they disperse widely or return back to the original capture site? On March 12th, inquiring minds who want to know. We'll find out the latest results from the studies of Dr. Eiserman and his graduate students. And I'd also like to mention to those joining on Zoom, if you could please mute your microphone and turn off your screen. That helps with the bandwidth here to make sure that it is nice and steady to you while the show is going on. Now back to tonight's speaker. After earning a zoology degree from UW-Madison, Lee Kernan began his career with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in 1964 at Horicon. And in 1968, he moved to the Green Bay office to be part of the brand new trout and salmon program for Lake Michigan in our area. How lucky for this 29-year-old biologist to have the opportunity to stock the first coho and chinook salmon into the Wisconsin waters of Lake Michigan. In addition, with the dramatic water quality improvements in the Fox River and Lower Green Bay in the 1970s, he also participated in the reintroduction of walleye and muskies into Green Bay to recreate those fisheries which had been absent for up to 20 years. By 1979, Lee moved to Madison to lead the Great Lakes section of the Bureau of Fisheries Management. And 11 years later, he was promoted to Director of Fisheries and led the entire fisheries program statewide until his retirement in 1997. Lee has always been a great communicator and storyteller. As a columnist and writer in his spare time over the last 29 years, he has published around 300 articles for the Wisconsin Outdoor News and other sport fishing magazines. Because of his extensive resume, accolades, and achievements, in 2021, he was inducted into the Freshwater Fisheries Hall of Fame and Museum in Hayward, Wisconsin. A former DNR Secretary, George Meyer, said the Hall of Fame for Kernan was well-deserved. Lee was an outstanding director of fisheries for DNR. His technical knowledge and straightforward talk was well recognized and appreciated by sport anglers. But probably first and foremost, Lee has always been a diehard fisherman and an outdoorsman. He was always eager to make sure staff and friends got on the water. In 1983, when McHale and I moved to Sturgeon Bay as the fishery station supervisor, we did not have a Great Lakes ready boat. But Lee eventually made sure he took us salmon fishing off Bailey's Harbor. And here's the evidence of the great fishing day that we had. I know firsthand that Lee was a strong leader, a staff motivator, and a valued mentor who acknowledged that, and I quote, "Nobody ever does these things alone." And I was fortunate to have great people working along me for my whole career. Lee was a leader that surrounded himself with the highest quality staff and inspired loyalty. And just out of curiosity, how many previous or current DNR employees are here tonight? Would you raise your hands? Wow. And that makes my point. So, this may be the only time I have a chance to introduce a Hall of Famer. And so I'm going to use Joe Buck's sort of format. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Foley. I'm the organizer of the Fish Tales Lecture Series. And joining us tonight is the Hall of Famer, Lee Kern.
Wow. Apparently, I caught him out of bullshit too. Thanks, Mark. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Nice crowd, and there's a lot of people in this room that, can you hear me all right? Yes. That know as much about fisheries probably as I do, so I'll have to be on my Q's and Q's. To start about Lake Michigan salmon, we got to go back a little bit. I got to give you a few facts from the past. Well, let's go back 200 years ago. Lake Michigan was chock full of huge lake trout, natural fish, whitefish, and brook trout along the shore. There were no other trout or salmon in Lake Michigan. The nearest salmon would have been below Niagara Falls, where the Atlantic salmon tried to get up and couldn't get past it. And they ran instead into the rivers of upstate New York. The West Coast salmon are 2,000 miles away. So when the settlers first got here, especially those from Scandinavia that were good commercial fishermen, you know, they didn't have motors and boats. They fished near shore. And all the shoreline living strains of lake trout were pounded first and really diminished in numbers. And they couldn't get out to fish in 200-300 feet of water because their equipment wasn't good enough. And as early as 1911, the commercial fishermen called their legislator and went to the governor and said, we need a fish hatchery. Can you imagine? In 1911, and they built a fish hatchery in Sturgeon Bay and in Milwaukee, and they actually stocked young lake trout that long ago. They could see that things were gradually going down. At that time, we were catching about 8 million pounds of lake trout each year. And I grew up in Sheboygan, which explains my love for Lake Michigan. And I had a relative that was a commercial fisherman. I remember being a small boy, my father took me down to the docks in Sheboygan. I was probably 10 years old, and one of my relatives had a fish tug, and they had a box full of lake trout. This would have been about 1949. And I remember the tails were very orange because it was October and it was spawning season. That stuck with me my whole life. So what changed? Well, how about the Welland Canal in 1932 when they built a way to get around Niagara Falls? And that was the beginning of the end for the Great Lakes fisheries as we know. Sea lampreys came in, and the first ones were seen about 1940 or 49 in Lake Michigan. And they decimated the lake trout. The lake trout were already hurting a little bit from commercial fishing, but the lamprey finished them off. And then in came the alewives in 1954. And I grew up in Sheboygan, and in high school, I would take my dog for a walk along the beach, and the windrows of the alewives were 20 feet thick, mile after mile. Stink was unbelievable, and the alewives were dying. You could see them swirling around like that. It was really something. Then in 1955, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was formed, which joined Canada and US together, and they were trying to figure out a way to get rid of the sea lamprey and bring lake trout back, basically for commercial fishing. They didn't think much of sport fishing back in the 50s. And so they began working, and they developed, of course, the famous chemical called TFM that you could drip into the system. Now, before that, they were trapping sea lampreys with weirs and trying to remove them, but it was not effective enough. And the closest one to where we stand was up at Hibbert's Creek, just west of Jacksonport on County Trunk A. And there was a weir there that was electric, and it guided the lampreys into a cage. And then we had a person hired up there for the summer or during the run, and he would empty them out every day. But the Great Lakes Fish Commission, of course, was working on bringing back lake trout. So they began stocking lake trout in 1965, even before the lampreys were controlled, because they were betting on the come that lampreys don't attack fish till they're about 17 or 18 inches long. So they knew that they had a couple of years grace before the fish grew big enough to be attacked. And meanwhile, they started treating with chemicals and they knocked the hell out of the young lampreys in the streams. Now, that was in 1965. Let me jump back a little bit. Before the DNR was here, it was called the Wisconsin Conservation Department. And that changed in 1968 when the DNR was formed. Now, the old WCD, as it was called, which hired me, had fish, wildlife, forestry, and that was about it. Whereas the new DNR had environmental protection and landfills and pollution and so forth. So that was all joined in 1968. Now, in 1963, the only fish manager we had or biologist around was a fellow named Larry Wiegert, and he was stationed in Green Bay. And his job, basically, he did the whole lake from the tip of Door County all the way down to Kenosha. And basically, all he ever really did was check in on commercial fishermen and find out what they were catching, how many pounds of chumps per box and stuff like that. But in 1963, the DNR or WCD fish hatcheries had a banner year, and they had way more rainbow trout than they needed. So they went to the fish managers around the state and said, hey, you want extra fish? And they all said, no, we got all we need to stock. We can't put any more in. But Larry said, well, would you let me put some in Lake Michigan? And they said, why not? So he began stocking rainbows at Lily Bay Creek, just 5 miles from here. And that was the first stocking of modern trout stocking in Wisconsin. And he did that for 3 or 4 years. And of course, they came back in a year or two, just like salmon, and they were 17, 18, 22 inches long. And it was looking like it was going to be a big success. And then Larry, unfortunately, died of a heart attack in his late 40s. And it was his vacancy that drew me from Horicon up here, that I just always loved the lake from growing up in Sheboygan. And so I transferred to Green Bay. And I came up here just at the time that Jim Moore, where's Jim? Jim got out of college, and the two of us reported for duty at Green Bay. And we sat in the office one day and looked at each other, and we didn't have any help. We had a boat, but nothing to pull it. And I said, what the hell are we going to do? And he said, well, let's go meet the commercial fishermen and drive up and down the county and see what we can learn. And that's how it all started. That's what we did. Well, meantime, over in Michigan, they had 2 new directors of fisheries. One was Howard Tanner and one was Wayne Toady. And they had been educated on the West Coast at Oregon and Washington. And they were familiar, let me get a drink here. They were familiar with Pacific salmon. So they looked at the salmon. Now there's 5 kinds of Pacific salmon, and each one has 2 names. The Chinook is also the king. The coho is the silver. The chum is a dog. The pink is a humpback, and the red is a sockeye. So that confuses people. But anyway, they looked at the different salmon and decided we should try to put something in Lake Michigan to eat the alewife and provide fishing. Now, you read everywhere today, they say the DNR stocked salmon to control alewife. We stock salmon to provide fishing. And Tanner said famously, he said, you don't put cows on the pasture to cut the grass. You put cows there to eat steak. And that's what the salmon did. They ate steak. So Michigan stocked several million salmon in 1966 culls. I don't remember when they started Chinooks, maybe the year after. And it was then that the businessmen of Algoma, who were led by a fellow named Gerald Hagley, and he was the one that had the JAG signs painted that said JAG on the end. Well, he and the mayor, who was Art Detman, wrote letters and talked to their legislators and said, we want some salmon put in Algoma for tourism. And they contacted Madison, and my bosses at that time, who I, of course, barely knew, I was a peon, they said, can we get some salmon? And Michigan said, we'll give you $25,000. for stocking in the spring of '68, just grass. So here I am coming up in 1968. I've got, my first duty is to find a place to put 25,000 salmon. I've never seen a goddamn salmon, you know. And Jim and I were facing that together. Well, the folks at Algoma had determined there was a little creek that ran into the Alapee River just on the northwest side of town. And they said, well, we'll make this into a pond for you. But when we looked at it, it was 20 inches of ice on it. This is marsh. I said, what the hell are we gonna do? Don't worry, they hired a dynamiter. He blew the crap out of that ice, and the ice chunks were this thick, and I mean, weighed 500 pounds. They got in there with backhoes, they pulled them all and said, there, bring the salmon. So we did. And well, maybe we can start with one of the first pictures now. So anyway, I got to backtrack again a little bit. A lot of stuff was going on here. I had been speaking at the Sturgeon Bay Chamber of Commerce in '68, telling them what the plans for Lake Michigan. And one of the special wardens, Dan Cuskovar, came up to me after. He said, hey, he said, you know where Strawberry Creek is? I said, no. He said, well, it's a little creek on the south side, runs into almost to the ship canal. And he said, well, I was up there yesterday, and he said there was all this splashing and there were fish in there. He said, I thought they were carp, but he said they look kind of pink. So, so I called Jim, and the next day he and I drove out there, and we looked at the creek, and that sucker was full of salmon this big coho salmon, Brett, and first one I'd ever seen, an adult. And I went, holy cow. And Jim and I we're not the smartest bulb on the block, but we figured if salmon came across Lake Michigan by accident and went up Strawberry Creek, maybe this would be a good spot to stock some. You know? and so that's how we chose Strawberry Creek. Let's have the now. Then this is what a fall spawning male coho looks like. Big kite. So that fish is just 3 years old. And even before we stocked that, when Michigan stocked their salmon, they found out that a lot of them migrated south. No one knows why, they still do. And they were catching them down in Indiana, and then in Illinois, and then they came up towards Kenosha. And in Sheboygan, they came up to, and I went there one day with my boat, and this is Paul Schultz, the former and now passed away fish manager from Plymouth. I took him fishing, and we caught these. He caught these 4 cohos. I got skunked. And these were Michigan fish that were coming up the shoreline even before we hadn't even stocked their salmon yet. But then they came up, and they discovered they came up about not even the Sturgeon Bay, and then they apparently angled back across Lake Michigan. So this was the first cohos I saw in hand that were kind of adults, other than the ones at Strawberry Creek. So this is a pond at Algoma that the guys dynamited the ice, and we put a little weir on that. Had the hatchery guys from Wild Rose come over, and they built a little cement outlet with boards in it and put a screen on top to keep the salmon in. Because if you remember, I know a lot of you know this, but salmon remember the water they're in when they smolt, which means when they're about 5-6 inch cohos, 5-6 inches long. So this means you can take a salmon, raise them in a hatchery for a whole year, bring them to a pond, let them in that pond, and they'll raise, when they smolt, they'll remember the smell of this and not the hatchery that they lived in for a whole year. And that's what makes salmon return to the spot. So one day I hired, actually, Jag Hagley hired his dad. We didn't hire him. He was a volunteer. He fed the salmon for me. And I came to check him one day, and I went down to the outlet, and all of a sudden, where I never saw salmon before, there were hundreds of them swimming into the current, facing away from the outlet. And, you know, what did I know? I thought, this is suspicious, you know. They didn't behave like this before, and I threw food in, and they didn't eat. I thought, oh, hell, they must be telling me they're ready to go. So I pulled out the boards in the pond and watched them, and instead of turning around swimming this way, they drifted backwards and let the current take them through and into the Anape River. I went, holy cow, this is gonna work. So I did that. I didn't know how many. I called my boss and said, hey, I just let the salmon go and explain it to him. He said, great. So the next week I went to Algoma. I went almost every day for days. And I stood in the Anape River down below where that creek run in. And I was there in the evening and I could see little dimples in the water. And all of a sudden, these fish started jumping, and here all these little coals were feeding on flies and insects. And I mean, the whole river, well, 25,000 is a lot of dimples. And I watched that and I just said, if you ever seen a guy happy, that was me. Okay. So we released those fish. And in 1 year, then after that, in a year and a half, they came back the size of the one on the right. And then that was the size we stocked the next year in the Algoma pond. So they grow from the left to the right in one summer. Wow. Keep going. As it turned out, we increased our salmon pond or release ponds, and we did put them in these areas. And we hadn't stocked Chinooks yet that year. That was the next year, okay. That was a rainbow that we shocked in the Kewaunee River. I just wanted to show you that the lamprey was still a problem in the late 60s. And that's the kind of scar that you would find on trout and salmon. And it was fatal for many of them, but not all. Some of them survived, but it's a pretty ugly wound. And I was about 29 years old there. Haven't changed much. Next. So when the Chinooks came, and they sent over for free 65,000 little baby Chinooks. Now Chinooks only live in the stream for the summer, and then they migrate, whereas cohos live a year and a summer. So cohos are 18 months when they run to the ocean. Chinooks are 6. So here we are, the size of the Chinook salmon, and that's me in the middle, and that I think that's the mayor of Sturgeon Bay at the time, and the guy on the right is Barney Irwin, who was the head of the Door County Chamber of Commerce. So before we put these fish in the stream, this is where we had all the big cohos running. Jim and I had to build a fence or a weir so they just wouldn't leave, because we didn't want them to leave until they smolted and remembered the smell of Strawberry Creek. So Jim and I got sledgehammers, and we were just he and me. We didn't have any help. And 2x4s and some mesh wire. We put on waders and we walked down the stream and we tried to dig into the sod along, and it was really hard to do. We went and got a saw, like a wood saw, and we're sitting there, we're sawing canary grass. We did this, and Jim turned to me and threw down a thing. He said, we're not biologists. He said, we're sledgehammer biologists. Because manual labor, but there was no one else to do it. But we built it, and when we got it built, we built it upstream so it was like a V, so that the current would carry the materials down and not plug it up. Well, luckily for us, which we didn't know, Strawberry Creek down there is under the influence of Lake Michigan water levels. And when you get a wind from the east or Seiche on Lake Michigan and the water level goes up, Strawberry Creek would run backwards once in a while. Well, backwards, it pushed all the crap off the screens and cleaned it, and then it would flow again that way. So just dumb luck, but it worked. So it wasn't long, and you can see this is the catch of salmon that we found by running field census and checking fishermen in all the different ports. And it's amazing, we're up to 500,000 fish, or over 500,000 fish by 1977. There's no question about what caused the good fishing. It was what we were stocking. Is the next one on there? Yeah. So this is what happened after that. This is the part we showed you was on the left. But look again, we still have terrific fishing, but there was right after we stocked 10, 15 years, that's when there was just an incredible amount of food in the lake and survival was really high. But still, it became, I think, probably the greatest sport fishery in America. It's not more than that. Okay. Well, about that time, we didn't have any money because our program was new. So I talked to the people down in Racine, Kenosha. They were forming sport fishing clubs. And I said, we don't have enough money to continue this. And they said, well, how about if we have a salmon stand? I said, yeah, but I can't. If a state employee goes to the governor and says, I want a salmon stamp, they'd throw you out on your ear. You know, you got to have the people have to ask that. So I said, you have to do it. And they did. They formed committees and groups and talked to their congressmen or their legislators. And we got in the writing the creation of a salmon stamp. And then we hired an artist who volunteered to do the very first painting of this Chinook. And also, at the same time, after the salmon were going pretty well, we began stocking brown trout, and we began to catch brown trout like this along Lake Michigan. And I got to tell one little story. I had ordered a bunch of brown trout to be stocked. This is like 1975 in the Skiwani, and the truck came and they had like 5,000 brown trout, about 6-7 inches long. And it was in June, and there were dying alewives swimming around in the water and doing circles. And the truck back in, they put the big aluminum pipe on, and they flushed these fish. Now here's fish that were hatched in the hatchery, raised in a raceway for a year, fed by throwing pellets to them so they'd follow the people along when you're feeding them. These fish had never been in the wild, never seen anything. They were dumb as a rock. And we flushed them into Lake Michigan, and I watched them. They started eating alewives right at my feet. They grabbed alewives and they'd have them sticking out like a banana. And there's all these hundreds of brown trout are swimming around with alewives sticking out in 5 minutes. And I didn't have anybody to talk to. I was there by myself. And I said, this is going to work. And it did. Next. So back then, we broke the state record for rainbows, Chinooks, browns about every month, it seemed. And this is Jim Moore. Back in what year, Jimmy?
I think it was 72.
72. And look at the depth on that salmon. So you think fish haven't changed a little bit. They don't get shaped like that anymore. That's when alewives were thick. And Jimmy had the county record that lasted for a week, huh? That was the day, those are the days they caught rainbows off Algoma. They broke the state record like three weeks in a row. It's crazy. Next. At the same time, the lake trout that the feds had stocked were doing very well. And this was Jay Court of the Forester, and I had a good day up with Gills Rock fishing lake trout. This would be about 1970. And those were the first, that's how big the fish were that they stocked in 1965 already. So they were doing great.
Oh my God.
And this is my lovely wife with the biggest perch I've ever seen. This is actually a peacock bass from the Amazon. It's my last picture, but I had to show my wife because I've been married to her for 40 years and I have to keep her happy. That's it. Okay, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Hang on, I'll get up there.
They have another plant there.
Yeah, I was wondering why the salmon approached Strawberry Creek the first time you saw them, because they were raised there. Why would they have come up that creek then?
I could not hear that.
Why did the salmon come up Strawberry Creek the first time when you walked out and saw them?
We don't know. Those were cohos and they were strays. Now, salmon have a strong homing instinct. but it's not 100%, because if it was, there'd only be salmon in one river. So they're designed to have certain amount of straying so that they spread their range. But to bring Michigan fish 65 miles or 70 miles across Lake Michigan into Strawberry Creek, we don't know why they did it, but we took it as something good.
Other questions?
Do you still plant? Do you still plant in Strawberry Creek?
Yes, we still release Chinook salmon there. It's still, I think, is it, who's from here? What fishery guys are here? Is it still the main release site, or have we equaled it in other spots?
So Strawberry Creek is our primary egg collection site for Chinook salmon.
Okay.
And then we also have the Bisani facility and the Root River down in Racine that are backup egg collections for Chinook salmon.
Thanks. I don't know that. I've been retired for 27 years.
So
29.
Lee, what did Russ Daly call the first salmon planting? The
Well,
wonder fish?
Well, they call them the wonder fish, yeah.
Yeah, because when
Well-
they stocked them, you wondered if they're gonna live. And then you wondered if they're gonna be able to catch them.
Yeah.
And when they all came back, you're gonna wonder what the hell we're gonna do with them all, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I noticed, when you had your statistics there, when they first shot up, there was a spike in 77. And then it's like, seemed to come back down for a few years and do a gradual slope, pretty good slope and a spike back in the 80s. Do you know why you had that 77 slope?
Well, that was about the time that we had a disease problem. And there was called bacterial kidney disease. And up to that time, we were kind of just, how should I say it? Things were going so well, we weren't as careful as we should have. We just took, a fish came in, we took their eggs. After we found out they were dying after being put in the lake, then we started checking each fish and just trying to separate the healthiest from the non-healthiest, but it was a disease problem. And it actually cropped up first in Michigan when in the spring, they started finding dead Chinooks on the beach at Benton Harbor, way down in the southeast corner. And I remember when I read that, and I said to Jim, I said, this doesn't sound good, because they were, young Chinooks that shouldn't have been dying. But we solved that.
Yeah, that really caused a lot of discussion with the states around the lake, because Lake Michigan thought the thing they had to do was stock more. And Wisconsin was arguing, no, we should stock less to increase the survivability. So that actually went on for a few years before we came to an agreement. And actually, in the long run, they stocked less. So that came a lot from the leadership that came from Wisconsin DNR.
To be real truthful, in retrospect, I didn't think it was going to last this long, as good a fishing as it is. I thought that can't continue. It's too good. And now with the zebra and the quagga mussels coming in, it's looking pretty bleak. I mean, Lake Huron is not worth a damn right now for salmon, and it's creeping our way fast. And, the only place where there's lots of food for fish right now is Green Bay. So here, when we were here in the 70s, we were always arguing and yelling at Green Bay for all the pollution that they were putting in from all the paper mills and the sewage plant. And now it's all that pollution and fertility in Green Bay that's keeping the whitefish alive there. You never know how things are going to turn out. But it was so bad that the water was bad all the way up to Little Sturgeon Bay. But now it just means lots of fertility and lots of food for the whitefish. So right now, Green Bay is the last bastion of a really healthy fishery. Who would have thunk it? Not me. Yes.
Speaking of commercial fish, what was your experience with a commercial fisherman when you decided to put all these silver fish out there that you knew were gonna grow up really big? What was their response? Like, how did you what were your interactions like? Because I'm sure they weren't particularly thrilled when you're putting all those hungry mouths out there. What was that like?
Well, they weren't so angry, I think, upset about the salmon. They wanted to catch the lake trout that had basically been stocked for the commercial fishery. But the lake trout weren't reproducing. And so that meant that everything they caught wouldn't live, and lake trout can live, years and years. And so we just knew it was gonna take time for them to get old enough. And so as far as the salmon goes and that, the commercial fishermen weren't real upset about that, but they did want to hack in on lake trout harvest. And meanwhile, the whitefish were doing well, so it was fairly compatible. Within reason,
Had a good buffer out there with all the alewives.
Yeah, so now Lake Michigan is so clear. What did you say the other day, Mark? Somebody saw
There's been second disc readings of 70 feet.
a white disc that's 10 inches in diameter. They lower in the water to see it, to measure clarity, and it's 70 feet they could see it. Oh my God.
Lake Michigan was deemed the clearest lake now. It's not Lake Superior.
But what that means is there's no food.
Right.
Well, there's food, but the zebra mussels and quagga mussels put the food on the bottom because they have called pseudo feces, if you can believe that. It's still crap, but they are taking the food out of the water column and depositing it on the bottom in little turds. Now, the only fish that live down there are gobies and sculpins and things like that. So it's taking the food away from everybody who lives up high.
Is there anybody on Zoom that would like to ask a question? If so, just unmute yourself and ask it. We'll hear it on the speaker system here. Apparently not. Oh, here's the.
I appreciate you coming and speaking with us today. It adds to my knowledge, and having grown up every summer up here from the 60s onward, seen the alewives in Jacksonport on the beach like you were talking about, and the ups and downs of fishing. The person that turned me on to limnology in general was Lynn Frederick. I don't know, out of Bailey's Harbor. She ran a charter, and that's how we got to know her. And we got more education as kids with my dad out on the boat. And so this is just filling even more information. Where do you see things going in the future? And with your experience and your background, I know you're not necessarily actively in it, but where are we going from here?
My feeling is unless something happens to put the clamper on the mussels, we're screwed. I don't know how the lake's gonna recover if we don't get rid of those mussels, and I don't know how we're gonna do that. I'm hoping some disease, I mean, everything else, when it gets that abundant, usually some disease crops up and kills them off, but it hasn't happened yet. But unless that happens, the only place there's gonna be fish is where there's a lot of fertility, and that's lower Green Bay. And I mean, the other lakes are worse off than Lake Michigan, but we're heading that way.
Scary.
It is scary.
Although you do see in the later years here, there's a bit of intake or uptick of Chinooks and so on. And I know, just to add my little perspective, but I know that, back in the days when Lee was here and active, the more you stocked, the more you caught, right? And you ran into that BKD issue, and that caused a big change, which is that first drop. But now it's gotten to the point where the fish managers have to be much more aware of what forage is out there, so they don't overstock. So they're actually managing by a predator-prey ratio, where they come up with estimates of how many predators are out there, and then the USGS does the forage base to tell you how many alewives are out there, and they're trying to maintain a certain ratio. So if there's not enough alewife there, they have reduced stocking to try to balance that out. And so it's getting much more complicated or comprehensive. But so there may not be the booms like we've seen in the past, but they're trying to make sure the fish are out there healthy and produce a good fishery. And, I've talked to some charter fishermen, and they say, yeah, it's not like the old days, but now you can catch a, brown trout or lake trout once in a while, and it fills it up. So, there's still some fisheries that are doing, pretty well. at least enough to keep going.
The one thing that they have going on in southern part of Lake Michigan that we don't have going on up here. Like, for instance, you've got Wind Point, you've got North and South Reef off of Wind Point. Since the water's turning clearer, the sun gets down, both of those points, those humps out there are actually filled with weeds. You have weeds growing in 20, 30, 40 feet of water where we never used to have that. But that's something we haven't seen up here.
Very interesting.
There's a
Yeah, we don't know
question on.
what's that gonna do?
Well, it gives your young of the year fish, particularly down there, your perch, more places to hide rather than being in schools in the open. So the perch down there, you can go off the power plant, and you can catch perch from 6 inches all the way up to close to 20 inches.
Well, I didn't know about that, but that's
Yeah.
great.
Yep,
So I do see a question on Zoom that are salmon spawning naturally in the Anafi River?
Not that I know of, I don't think so.
Yeah.
We used to have some natural coho spawning in the little Scarborough Creek, which flows into the Kiwanee River, but since we built a salmon collection station on the Kiwanee, we blocked the river off, they can't get up there. But that is a worthy subject. For example, in Michigan, most of their Chinooks now are hatching naturally. And they're putting thousands of Chinooks into Lake Michigan, which we've kind of lost control now because that's all natural. And we don't have much of that on our side. Our rivers are too warm and too fertile, and the eggs might hatch, but they don't make it.
Yeah, in terms of natural reproduction, just to put it in perspective, it is happening in Michigan waters where they have class 1 trout streams that come in there. And through the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, they've been able to estimate that 60% of the salmon that are in the lake are from wild sources, not from being stocked. So that's another balance that the managers have to balance, how many, do we need to stock a lot or don't? And then if there's not, because they don't control natural reproduction, they can certainly control what comes out of the hatchery, but it just adds another little quirk into their management scheme.
well, the Platte River in Michigan has more coho spawning out of the Platte River than any other Michigan in the country, than any other river. So their weirs, they have counters below each section of weirs. They have 8 sections in the Platte River. And they have counters down there that when they get to 1 million fish, they open up the weirs so they go up to the next section. And according to the DNR over there, they've had as many as 22 million fish in the river at one time. All spawning.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know about it.
Any more questions from the Zoom? You can unmute yourself and just talk, we'll hear you.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. So when this all started, you were getting the initial fish from Michigan, but then I'm guessing 2, 3, 4 years later, did you guys start your own collection here in Sturgeon Bay and the rivers along Lake Michigan? And because of that stamp, is that what built the first hatcheries for us?
Yes, we used stamp money to build the weirs at Kiwanee and down on the Root River, and we took our own eggs from then on. We were no longer dependent on Michigan. And have been for, well, I think we only got eggs or fish from Michigan for maybe 3 years, way back in the 70s. So.
Why have the brook trout all but disappeared?
Because they probably quit stocking them. Somebody here from,
There's a little bit of stocking recently, but it's been discontinued again. Just not enough room and not enough money to produce them.
they never produced terrific fishing, but they produced some fish, but nothing like the Browns.
And there really isn't any coastal populations in Lake Michigan, right? Like there is in Lake Superior. So there's not enough natural reproduction to sustain it either.
Do they still plant browns?
Okay, what?
Do they still plant browns? Brown trouts?
Well,
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we still stock brown trout.
Okay.
Chinook salmon, Kobo salmon, steelhead, and brown trout are the four species that we stock presently.
Any other questions? Well, these are stories that you won't hear anywhere else.
In 2 weeks. You can learn about smallmouth bass behavior. So hope to see you all then. Thanks a lot.
You.